Thank you for coming to the Mercatus Center's Capitol Hill campus program today on regulatory analysis. A couple matters of housekeeping. First, you will find under your PowerPoint slides, there's a blue sheet of paper. That is a survey, and if you would please fill that out, I'd greatly appreciate it. We're trying to constantly adapt the program to be the most useful that it can be for you guys here on the Hill and at the agencies. And so we do really try to use your feedback to constantly help us achieve that goal. We had some toolkits, regulatory toolkits and report cards out on the table. We have ran out. In the thank you note email that will go out, we'll be sure to link to that on our website. You'll be able to find both our toolkit and our report card. And with that, let me introduce Dr. Jerry Ellig is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center, where he has worked since 1996. His primary research interests include the federal regulatory process, economic regulation, and telecommunications regulation. Between August 2001 and August 2003, he served as Deputy Director and Acting Director of the Office of Policy of Planning at the Federal Trade Commission. Dr. Ellig has also served as a senior economist for the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress and an assistant professor of economics at George Mason University. Dr. Ellig has published numerous articles on government regulation and business management in both scholarly and popular periodicals, including The Public Manager, Journal of Politics, Journal of Regulatory Economics, Managerial and Decision Economics, Antitrust Bulletin, Texas Review of Law and Politics, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, Barron's, and The Washington Post. He has co-authored, edited several books, including Dynamic Competition in Public Policy, New Horizons in Natural Gas Deregulation, and Municipal Entrepreneurship and Energy Policy. Dr. Ellig earned his PhD and MA in economics from George Mason University and his Bachelor of Arts in economics from Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. With that, please welcome Dr. Ellig.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, what I'm going to try to do today is just walk through the basic elements of regulatory analysis. Now, when I do this in a class at George Mason for graduate students, it usually takes about half a semester, and I'm going to try to do it in 40 minutes today. When I mentioned that to one of the guys who had taken the class a few years ago, he looked at me and he said, well, why didn't you do it in 40 minutes in our class? And I said, well, because I don't know if it can be done, so we'll find out. We'll find out. I noticed some familiar faces. I know there are a number of folks here who were here when I did a course on the basics of the regulatory process in July. The way these fit together is, you may remember if you were at that course that there was one slide that says, here's the things that ought to be in a good regulatory analysis. What I'm doing today is simply expanding on that one little slide. Okay, at the outset, I want to distinguish between two different things. It is one thing to do regulatory analysis that tries to figure out what are the likely results of a regulation, what are the likely results of its alternatives. It's another thing to actually make a decision judging whether the likely results are good or bad and saying, well, let's go ahead and do that regulation, or no, wait, let's not do that regulation, let's choose this alternative instead. So regulatory analysis is about understanding cause and effect and understanding the likely results of a regulation. It's about understanding reality. That's different from making a value judgment about whether the likely effects of regulation are good or bad and then deciding whether to do it or not. The analysis is not the decision. It's just an input into the decision, hopefully important, useful information. Well, there are about four main elements of a good regulatory analysis, and believe it or not, they don't start with counting anything. Regulatory analysis is fundamentally about understanding cause and effect, not about counting beans. First thing is understanding what kind of problem you're trying to solve and understanding its root cause. The second thing in a good regulatory analysis is figuring out what counts as success. If we successfully solve this problem, what good thing will happen for society or some subset of society as a result of that? What counts as a good result? How will we know whether it happened? So figuring out what outcome, what counts as a successful outcome. Third, what are the alternative ways of solving the problem and achieving that outcome? Regulatory analysis fundamentally is about understanding the effects of alternative choices, not just trying to figure out what are the costs and benefits of this regulation that we're thinking of proposing. And then finally, comparing the pros and cons of the different alternatives. Ideally, a good analysis is going to have a good understanding of cause and effect for all of these things and some evidence that the theory is actually true. So we're looking at alternative ways of doing things, weighing the pros and cons, trying to figure out the pros and cons. Regulatory impact analysis can actually be done at 3 different times. The first way it can be done is before legislation authorizing a regulation is passed. Now, this doesn't happen much in the United States. It's actually required in the European Union. They have to do what they call impact analysis for legislation. In the United States, most of the time when regulatory impact analysis is performed in the federal government, it happens when agencies are proposing regulations. Ideally, the agency does its regulatory impact analysis to figure out how to write a regulation and whether to regulate. In practice, a lot of times it gets done after a lot of decisions about the regulation have been made. But in any case, it's done around the same time that the agency is developing a regulation. Another time this analysis can be done is retrospectively. After a regulation is in place, you can do regulatory impact analysis to figure out, well, gee, what actually happened? Did it achieve the benefits we hoped it would achieve? What did it actually cost as opposed to what we predicted that it might cost? Okay, well, let's get to the first item. Identifying a systemic problem. What kind of problem are we trying to solve, and what's the root cause? There are really about 3 kinds of things that typically federal agencies focus on when they're trying to understand a systemic problem. One is a category of problems referred to as market failures, failures of market institutions to achieve optimal results. And I'm not going to go into long-winded definitions of all the possible types of market failures. The most important thing you ought to know is that these things have specific definitions, and the concepts are often misunderstood. A market failure is not any market result that I don't like. It's a failure of markets to achieve an optimal result. And some of the most common reasons you may have market failures that are relevant to regulation are market power, where a firm, a monopoly or close to a monopoly has the ability to raise the price above the competitive level. So you may have some type of economic regulation to try to remedy that. Externalities, where a particular party or a firm imposes costs or confers benefits on somebody else but doesn't take those into account. I mean, pollution is kind of the classic example of an externality. And various kinds of information problems. Asymmetric information, where one party in an exchange lacks access to information that might have materially affected their decision about what to do. Sometimes folks say imperfect information is a market failure, but really, our information's always imperfect, and information is costly to produce. So the fact that somebody's information may be imperfect may just be a sign that information, like everything else, is scarce. But there are certain classes of information problems, like information asymmetries, that economists normally recognize as market failures. Government institutions may also fail in a variety of ways for a variety of reasons, and agencies may write regulations to remedy various kinds of government failures. Failure to, one common one is a failure to specify or enforce particular property rights. One other type of government failure may be just plain inefficient administration. For example, a few years ago, the Social Security Administration proposed a regulation for scheduling the caseload of administrative law judges. And if you read it carefully, there wasn't much analysis, but if you read the regulation carefully, what this regulation was about was really trying to improve the process of scheduling administrative law judges' workloads in order to eliminate a big backlog of disability cases that Social Security was trying to deal with. So that's, there's some ways, some regulations just try to improve the efficiency of government administration. There are also other kinds of government failures, such as intentional or unintentionally. Regulations may create barriers to competition, create barriers to new competition. So regulations may create market power in some cases. Might be an economic regulation, or it might be some other type of regulation that, that inadvertently creates some market power. For example, you may have been bombarded lately with a lot of advertisements about telecom mergers, wireless phone company mergers, and so forth. One of the things, one of the ways to approach that issue is to say, well, gee, we have to be careful about allowing wireless companies to merge because they might get market power. But the other thing you have to realize is that the fundamental source of any market power that wireless phone companies may have is the fact that the amount of spectrum made available for wireless service is very limited. And so another potential way of trying to remedy this problem is to say, well, gee, let's go back to the original government failure, which is failure to make as much spectrum available as the market might need, rather than saying, let's limit these companies' ability to merge. You might get a better result by focusing on the fundamental government failure. There are also other types of pressing social needs that may motivate regulation, even in situations where there is nothing that qualifies as a market failure and nothing that qualifies as a government failure. And this partial list that I've got up here comes out of the executive orders that govern regulatory analysis and guidance from the Office of Management and Budget. Now, if you follow regulation, you may also have heard of something that the current director of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, Cass Sunstein, is famous for, which is writing a book called Nudge, which is about behavioral economics that deals with problems that arise when individuals fail to rationally perceive or process information. And in some sense, people make irrational decisions. And this is kind of a new and emerging area in economics. It has motivated a handful of new regulations. But the thing that we need to be aware of when we talk about these behavioral economics issues is that it's really not trying to remedy market failures, and it's really not targeting government failures. It's really targeting individual failures to perceive or to rationally process information. Now, Ron White says you can't fix stupid. In some sense, what folks are trying to do with regulations inspired by behavioral economics is to try to push people toward making more rational decisions, contrary to what Ron White suggests. There are several recent regulations that have been based on this kind of theorizing and research, including the FDA's regulation on requiring graphic warning labels on cigarette packages, which recently got thrown out by a federal judge. There are also some FDA regulations requiring calorie labels on food made available in vending machines and requiring restaurants to make nutritional information available. Those kind of things are intended to deal with those kind of problems. The idea that regulation ought to try to remedy these kind of individual failures is, I think, much more controversial than the idea that regulation is supposed to remedy market failures or government failures or deal with other pressing social needs. And we probably haven't had the full debate over that in this country yet. So more to come on that. Okay, so suppose you've identified the kind of systemic problem you're dealing with. Maybe it's a market failure, maybe it's a government failure. You've identified the root cause. What do you do next? Try to figure out, if we solve this problem, what good things are we going to produce of benefit to the public if we solve this problem. One of the most difficult things, and I'm one of the few people I know who does research both on regulation and on the Government Performance and Results Act, and for 10 or 15 years of working on Government Performance and Results Act stuff, one of the most difficult things I found was getting across the idea of what is an actual outcome that matters to citizens rather than a process or an activity and so forth. And similarly with regulations, we want to understand that if we're trying to define the outcome we want from a regulation, it's the actual benefit that's of value to the public that's produced by the regulation. For example, this year, Department of Transportation issued a regulation requiring truck drivers to have onboard recorders to monitor their movements and their working hours and so forth. And they were pretty blunt that, well, yeah, the purpose of this regulation is fundamentally to improve safety by reducing accidents. So the ultimate outcomes are reduced accidents, reduced injuries, reduced loss of life, and reduced property damage that come from accidents. Those are outcomes. But we don't always have that kind of thing. When I read federal regulations, I often find that even the agencies confuse activities or outputs or expenditures with outcomes. For example, in 2010, there was a regulation out of the Labor Department defining what is and is not a fiduciary relationship. This was out of the Employee Benefits Security Administration. And essentially, the regulation pretty much said, well, easier enforcement is the outcome we're after. Well, easier enforcement isn't an ultimate outcome that's of value to citizens. I mean, what's really of value to citizens in that context, I would think, would be better investment returns for the people whose money is being managed by some company that has a fiduciary relationship to them. And the regulation would have been a lot clearer if, in fact, the Labor Department had taken that as the outcome they were trying to achieve. Similarly, in 2011, the Department of Homeland Security, I just read this a couple of weeks ago, proposed a regulation requiring registration, permits and registration for people who want to buy and sell ammonium nitrate, which is useful as a fertilizer, but you can also use it to make a bomb. And to its credit, DHS says, look, the purpose of this thing is to try to, protect lives and property from terrorists who might want to buy ammonium nitrate to make bombs. But then there was this odd spot where it said, an additional benefit of this regulation is that this regulation implements the law requiring the Department of Homeland Security to issue this regulation. That's not an outcome. That's a process. It's not an outcome. Not an outcome. Ideally, the agency ought to be able to measure the effect of the regulation on the outcomes it's trying to achieve and identify the causal mechanism. If we issue this regulation, that leads to this, that leads to this, that leads to this, and then that produces the outcome. Again, when the Department of Transportation issued that regulation requiring truck drivers to have onboard monitoring equipment, they did a pretty good job of explaining how, if you have onboard monitoring of the truck drivers' hours and activities, that leads to increased compliance with hours of safety or hours of service regulations. And we've got pretty good evidence that when you get greater compliance with these hours of service regulations, you really do get a reduction in accidents. And so that was a case where the causal chain was laid out pretty well and substantiated with some evidence. And that's the kind of thing, if you're looking at an agency issuing a regulation, that's the kind of thing you would hope to be able to see an agency do all the time when it's issuing a regulation. Okay, so we've identified the systemic problem. We know what outcome we're trying to achieve. What are the alternative ways of doing it? And there are a couple of important things to keep in mind when thinking about alternatives. One is that there are alternatives to federal regulation. In fact, there are a whole mess of possible alternatives to federal regulation, and I'm not going to stand here and read them all off, but this list of alternatives ranges from things that are very non-regulatory, all the way to things that are, somewhat still regulatory. I mean, one alternative might be state or local regulation, depending on the particular topic or the issue, but a lot of different alternatives to federal regulation. One of the best examples of an agency examining a wide variety of alternatives that I've ever seen is the Department of Energy has a whole family of energy efficiency standards for appliances, furnaces, pool heaters, air conditioners. I almost said popcorn poppers. I don't think they do popcorn poppers. But in any case, they have kind of a standard operating procedure for doing their analysis of these regulations. And almost all the time when the Department of Energy establishes an energy efficiency standard for one of these things, its regulatory analysis includes a comparative analysis of the effectiveness of rebates to consumers to get them to buy the energy efficient appliance, tax credits to consumers, tax credits to manufacturers, voluntary efficiency targets rather than mandatory standards, early replacement subsidies like cash for clunkers only for furnaces, bulk government purchases, and no action. How will the market evolve if we don't issue a new regulation and just stick with the standards that already exist? An incredibly wide array of alternatives that the Department of Energy analyzes, even though the legislation even though the legislation is telling the department you must issue an appliance standard, but they still take a look at the effectiveness of a wide variety of alternatives to issuing that regulation. Yeah?
What is jawboning?
Oh, jawboning. That's simply government officials using their position to try and persuade folks to do something. Actually, the reason it's on that list is because of a particular example I was thinking of. I worked at the Federal Trade Commission for a couple of years, and I'm going to mess up the details of this, but when Tim Muris was chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, one of the things that the commission was trying to deal with was deceptive advertising for various kinds of weight loss products. And it turns out there are some aspects of, kind of deceptive advertising for weight loss products that regulators can't quite get to it because of First Amendment reasons. Tim actually made a speech to some broadcasters or some big association of entities, I forget if it was broadcasters or newspapers or magazines that sell advertising, and he called the speech "Do the Right Thing" with apologies to Spike Lee. And he essentially laid out the case that, look, there are some of these things that are pretty obviously deceptive, even though the federal government can't touch them for First Amendment reasons. And so I'm asking you people who sell advertising to, exercise some responsibility and don't accept advertisements where even you can look at it and say, yeah, this is probably deceptive. So, jawboning. Is a good example of using the expertise that a particular agency has to kind of lay out what the problem is and try to persuade people to do something on their own to solve it. Those are alternatives to federal regulation. If you've decided the federal government does need to regulate, there are also a lot of alternative ways of accomplishing regulation. Now, of course, the alternative that usually comes immediately to mind when we want to regulate something is command and control regulation. If somebody's doing something we don't want them to do, tell them they have to stop. If somebody isn't doing something we do want them to do, tell them they must do it. But I hope, as this example illustrates, that regardless of who your boss is, which political party you are, what your political philosophy is, that we can all agree that there are at least some cases where command and control regulation probably is not the most appropriate or effective solution. That's why I chose a book banning example here, because that's a kind of command and control regulation that most people probably would agree isn't likely to be appropriate in any case. Now, I don't know exactly what kind of social problem the Malaysian government was trying to solve with this regulation. I'm married, but I can't claim to be an expert on obedient wives, and I don't speak Malay, so I haven't read the book. But I think most people in the room would probably say, well, if there is a real problem there the government's trying to solve, there are probably less restrictive ways to do it. And it turns out there are a whole bunch of federal regulatory alternatives that are less restrictive than outright command and control. And I've listed a mess of them that are either listed in OMB guidance or that I've seen in real regulations over here. Just to give you a few examples of specific regulations that have done a good job of looking at different kinds of alternative tools. In 2008, the Department of Transportation proposed a pair of regulations intended to relieve congestion at LaGuardia Airport and at Newark Airport, because the way the current system had worked, there was no cap on the number of flights going into or out of those airports, and so the airlines, responding rationally, scheduled an excessive number of flights, but then you ended up with flight delays and airplanes circling, waiting to land. And so the Department of Transportation was saying, hey, how can we improve the management of these airports in order to get rid of that flight delay problem? And they came up with several alternatives that were rather different. One alternative was leave things as they are and don't cap the number of takeoffs and landings at LaGuardia and Newark. Another option was, well, let's put a cap on the number of takeoffs and landings at LaGuardia and Newark, cap it at some number that DOT calculates is the reasonable number that the airports could actually handle, so then you would have very few delays because you simply couldn't have any more takeoffs and landings than the airports could handle, and airlines wouldn't be able to overschedule. But then they looked at a third alternative, which was let's cap the total number of takeoffs and landings, but let's also take some takeoff and landing slots and auction them off to the highest bidder to try to help ensure that whoever valued those takeoff and landing slots the most would actually get them. And they had a couple of different auction proposals for a couple of different amounts. So it's kind of an innovative look at several rather different ways to try to solve that problem. Another example I remember, back in 2004, the Food and Drug Administration put out a proposed ruling on how to deal with the issue of health claims that the manufacturers of dietary supplements were making. Because FDA had lost some First Amendment cases because they were originally telling manufacturers of dietary supplements, you can't make any health claims unless we've approved them first. And the federal courts said, oh, really? Well, that sounds kind of restrictive. Can't you find some other way to do it? And the FDA proposed 3 very different alternatives. One alternative was that a manufacturer couldn't make a health claim unless they had submitted it to the FDA and had a notice and comment rulemaking proceeding on the health claim. Another alternative, which is what the FDA had been doing on an interim basis, was to say, well, the manufacturer can make a certain type of health claim based on the strength of the scientific evidence. And the FDA had several buckets where you would kind of classify the strength of the scientific evidence, and that determined the kind of claim the manufacturer could make. So the manufacturer could say something like, some studies have shown that, taking this supplement does this. Or they might say, many studies have shown, or there's significant scientific agreement, or whatever. Third alternative was very different. The FDA proposed a third alternative of what's known as post-market enforcement, which essentially means the manufacturer of the supplement could make whatever claim they want to make, but they had to be able to substantiate it if the FDA challenged it. That happens to be the way the Federal Trade Commission regulates deceptive advertising. The way the FTC approach is to say, you can say what you want, but if we challenge it, you have to have evidence that substantiates that the claim you're making is true. 3 very different approaches. One more thing I want to mention about alternatives, and emphasize that one key alternative that an agency always ought to be looking at, and if you look at a particular regulation, you ought to look to see if they're doing this, is looking at the baseline. That is, what will happen if we don't issue a new regulation? And that baseline is not necessarily what happened last year or what happened in past years or what happens if you extrapolate the trend from past years in the future, because other things might change that would make the future very different from the recent past. So really understanding the baseline requires asking questions like, how is the market likely to evolve in the future? One fun example of that is, the federal government issues periodically updates corporate average fuel economy standards for automobiles. Well, if you're trying to figure out how much energy, how much gasoline you save with corporate average fuel economy standards, it's going to be pretty important to have an understanding of how gasoline prices are likely to evolve in the future, not just look at the past, because it turns out that, when gasoline prices go up, people tend to buy more fuel-efficient vehicles. So if you want to try to project how much of an effect your fuel economy standard is going to have, you need to have some understanding and some projection of what fuel prices are going to be, what are gasoline prices going to be in the future, how will people react to that, and then how does that compare to what they would do if you issue the standard. Another thing you want to look at is external factors. Actually, that fuel price is a good example of an external factor. You'd also want to expect an agency to look at what other changes are likely to happen as a result of regulations that were recently adopted or are already in the pipeline that might affect the outcome that this regulation is supposed to produce. Now that sounds a little vague and fuzzy, but in that DOT's onboard recorder regulation again, they actually did a pretty good job of figuring out what the baseline was likely to be in the future. They actually looked at how is compliance with the federal standards for truckers' hours of service and rest periods, how is that likely to change as a result of regulations we recently issued and just recently took effect. So they projected how that was going to change. And they actually created 2 alternative baselines depending on which regulation they adopted in another related proceeding. So they actually recognized, The baseline in the future is going to be different depending on what we do in this other proceeding, and so we need to create a separate baseline for each of those two proceedings if we want to accurately figure out what this regulation is going to achieve. Now you notice I've stood up here a good while without talking about benefits or costs, even though a lot of times people refer to regulatory analysis as cost-benefit analysis or benefit-cost analysis, depending on your religion. That got a lot of I went to a Society for Benefit-Cost Analysis meeting a couple weeks ago. There really is such a thing, and those kind of comments get uproarious laughter. In any case, you remember, Heidi, you were there. In any case, only after you figure out what the systemic problem is, what outcome you're trying to achieve, and what the alternatives are, is it then appropriate to start asking, all right, well, how do we maybe try to measure or count the likely benefits and costs? Oh, one thing I forgot to mention about alternatives. There's a bit of fuss about, well, gee, why should agencies ever look at alternatives outside the scope of the statute since they can't adopt them? OMB tells them to go ahead and do that, which kind of makes sense because if agencies are supposed to be the repository of expertise, it's conceivable that when an agency analyzes a particular problem or issue, the agency might, come up with a conclusion or come up with an alternative way of dealing with a problem that's different from what Congress required, and Congress might want to know about that if we take the idea that agencies are supposed to be experts seriously. Okay. In understanding benefits and costs, it's important to distinguish between actually three things: benefits and costs and transfers. And the basic difference is this, that benefits, there we go, a benefit is something that makes society as a whole better off. A cost is whatever it is society gave up in order to acquire that benefit as a result of regulation. So, if you go back to if you took Econ 101, you may remember a concept called opportunity cost. In economic analysis, cost is always a benefit that you gave up in order to get what you decided that you were going to get. It's always foregone benefit, not Scrooge McDuck taking a dime out of his wallet. It's a foregone benefit. And those have to be distinguished from transfers. Transfers occur when regulation simply shifts wealth from one party or one firm to another. And those are important, and they matter a lot. And they tick off constituents, or they make constituents happy, and you hear a lot about them when people either complain about regulation or praise regulation. But transferring wealth from one person to another or from one firm to another isn't the same thing as creating a net benefit for society or imposing a net cost on society. And to make it even more confusing, usually regulations do all three of these things at the same time, so it's a challenge to disentangle them. Okay, what counts as benefits? Here's a few examples. If you're regulating a monopoly to try to account for the fact that that competition for one reason or another isn't occurring or isn't possible, the benefit from regulating a monopoly is the price falls and you get an increase in output, and the value of that additional output is the benefit that you've created for society. Securities regulation, to the extent that securities regulation makes capital markets more efficient and you get an increase in economic growth, that's the net benefits for society you get from securities regulation. Environmental regulation, you get improvements in health, reductions in premature deaths. Safety regulation, you get more safety, fewer premature deaths, fewer injuries. Homeland security regulation, you reduce the damage to lives and property due to terrorism. Yeah, those are the kinds of things that count as benefits. What kind of things count as costs? Well, it's a little more complicated. There are, why the heck did that pop up in the middle? There we go, okay. There are, first of all, some expenditures that count as costs. But that's not all. Because regulations also may shift around the use of resources, and you can get something that economists refer to as deadweight loss. When we issue a regulation that's intended to say create environmental benefits or create health and safety benefits, and it's a regulation that requires somebody to spend resources on those kind of things rather than something else. It may increase prices. So we may, whatever it is that's regulated, we may get a reduction in the production and sales of the thing that is regulated in order to get whatever benefit we're trying to create from regulation. That reduction in the sales or output of the thing that's regulated is an opportunity cost, even though we can't see it. But the fact that the production of the thing that's regulated is less than it would otherwise be is a cost that society bears, and that needs to be accounted for when we look at the costs of regulation. Similarly, the regulation may have an effect on quality of service, convenience, or whatever to customers. And if that's a negative effect, that's a cost. And we may even have risk trade-offs where we issue a regulation to try to reduce one risk over here, but it increases some other risk over there. Now, these are all vague. Let me give you an example from a type of regulation that everybody's probably familiar with, which is security screening at airports. If you only think of costs as money outlays, then you're only likely to look at the tip of the iceberg floating above the water here, which is Transportation Security Administration budget. These figures are a few years old, but the concepts are timeless. Again, what matters for doing good regulatory analysis fundamentally is understanding cause and effect and concepts rather than just the numbers. But they illustrate this a little bit. Transportation Security Administration budget a few years ago was a little over $4 billion. That's just the tip of the iceberg on the costs. Transportation Security Administration budget for airport screening comes from a tax that's applied to airline tickets, and that tax raises the price of air travel, so fewer people fly. That creates a deadweight loss. The value that customers would have received from taking the flights that they declined to take because the cost was higher, that deadweight loss is an opportunity cost. And we did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, figured that's around $2 to $2.5 billion. But there are some other effects. If you've ever visited an airport and gone through security, pre-9/11 and post-9/11, you know that it may lead to an increase in waiting time as well at the airport. And Department of Transportation actually has standard ways of putting a value on people's time that they spend in line waiting. And a back-of-the-envelope calculation suggests that was almost $3 billion in 2005, attributable to the increase in waiting time that we got from the increase in airlines or airport security screening post 9/11. In addition, we have a risk trade-off here. And this is actually out of published peer-reviewed research, which found that the increased security screening after 9/11 led to an increase in fatalities on the highways because people tended to substitute driving for flying on shorter flights. The particular article calculated that there might have been about 116 additional deaths in one quarter of the year. If you multiply that by 4, multiply it by a very conservative estimate for the value of a life, $5 million, you get about a $3 billion cost. So what's all this mean? If you add this stuff up, you find that the total cost of this regulation, which is below the waterline that you don't necessarily see, that isn't obvious, is about twice the cost that actually shows up in the federal budget. So the costs of regulation associated with things like deadweight loss, reductions in convenience, risk trade-offs can be much bigger than the explicit monetary outlays that we normally associate with compliance. Yeah?
But going that many orders down the line, saying it leads to traffic fatalities, then you can continue on down the line and say, well, it actually leads to increased revenues for Amtrak, or it leads to increased revenues at the toll plazas. I mean, you've got so many different 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th order effects that how can you possibly calculate them all, and where do you stop?
Well, yeah, it requires a judgment call to figure out what's likely to be, of significant size and what isn't. And by the way, yeah, increased revenues for Amtrak and increased toll revenues would be transfers, not costs or benefits, because it's just business shifts from the airlines to, the trains and whatnot. I think the way that you would make that judgment call is to actually look and find out, what do people do? I haven't seen any research that tries to figure out whether there's an appreciable increase in traffic on Amtrak post 9/11 as a result of the security screening at airports. My guess would be that since Amtrak carries such a small portion of intercity passengers, that's not likely to be a very big effect, and so we don't lose much if we don't pay attention to it. Substitution of driving for airline travel, on the other hand, can be a pretty big effect. So yeah, we might want to pay attention to that. But yeah, the place to make the cutoff, the way to make the cutoff is to figure out, well, is this likely to be big or little? If it's little, we don't have to pay attention to it. Okay, that was benefits, that was costs. What are transfers? Transfers may be either really obvious or, and I'm just going to put all of this up at one time because these aren't coming up in order. Transfers may be really obvious or they may be not so obvious. There are some regulations that implement federal spending programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and in those regulations, typically the transfers are really obvious. It's the amount of money the federal government is spending on the benefit. For other types of regulation, though, they may result in transfers of wealth that aren't so obvious because they don't appear on the federal budget. So, for example, if you have a regulation that affects the electric utility industry, decreases demand for electricity, increases demand for some other type of green power, you will have a transfer from, say, the coal industry or the electric utility industry loses business and producers of some type of green power gain business. Okay, there's a transfer of wealth from one industry to another, which is neither a cost nor a benefit. Yeah?
So why, I'm not quite understanding why the Medicare, Medicaid, why those aren't identified as costs, why those are identified as transfers?
Oh, because it's and by the way, it's not a bad question because sitting down and looking at a particular regulation, it's even hard to keep it straight sometimes. But essentially, what that regulation is doing is picking up money out of one person's pocket and putting it in another person's pocket. And so you wouldn't count the money that the federal government is spending as a cost of that regulation or as a benefit of that regulation. The fact that somebody receives the money isn't a net social benefit. The fact that somebody else had to pay it is not a net social cost. Actually, I should probably qualify that by specifying the kind of example and the kind of regulation I'm thinking of is the almost annual regulations that HHS has to issue that recalculate, say, Medicare and Medicaid payment rates that then result in a redistribution of money from one group of providers to another group of providers and so forth. That money, those changes don't really count as a cost. Now, if you're looking at the entire Medicare program and you're saying, okay, it spends, X $100 billion a year, yeah, the total amount of money spent is a cost. But if you're looking at some individual regulation that's adjusting how the money is doled out, that's not really changing the total amount of money, then it's just a transfer. Okay, now I'm going to flip to the issue that might be on a lot of people's minds, which is, okay, how do jobs come into all of this? Because that's of course a big thing that everybody is talking about and arguing about in regard to regulation now. How's it relevant to jobs? And I'm going to give you two takes on this. One is short term, one is long term. I mean, first off, long term. The principal thing that regulation does is it reallocates resources in the economy. We get more clean air, we get less coal mining. We get, say, a safer workplace, but maybe we have a little bit less production from some of those workplaces because businesses are spending money on complying rather than on producing, or because the price of whatever it is that's created is a little bit higher and people buy less of it. So regulation is going to have an effect, when it's reallocating resources from one thing to another. If you look at the industry or the particular thing that's regulated, yeah, we might lose some jobs there. But regulation also creates jobs in a variety of different ways. Regulation creates jobs, certainly complying with the regulation. People who have to figure out how to comply with the regulation, may have jobs that they wouldn't otherwise have had. Regulation may create jobs by increasing demand for substitutes for whatever the regulated thing is. So, I mean, one of the things I keep hearing, I'm not an environmental specialist, but one of the things I keep hearing about environmental regulation is that it has tended to benefit the natural gas industry as opposed to oil and coal, because natural gas is a cleaner fuel. So a lot of our environmental regulation has tended to increase demand for natural gas, decrease demand for other fossil fuels. So you have a certain amount of job creation as a result of substitutes. You have a certain amount of job creation to the extent that you get a bigger volume of regulation and more people in government are involved with administering regulation. And the whole sort of industry lobbying and influencing the government, you get an increase in that as well. Now, how on earth do we figure out whether that's a good or a bad thing? We can't figure out whether that's a good or a bad thing by counting jobs. The only way we can figure out whether that's a good or a bad thing is by figuring out which mix of outputs is most productive from society's perspective. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by doing good elemental regulatory analysis of the type that I was describing before. Okay, now, laying it out that way does omit one thing, which is short-term transitional issues. In the long term, we shouldn't expect to see regulations have a big effect on total employment. We're going to get a reallocation of jobs, not necessarily a net increase or a net decrease of jobs. But in the short term, there are going to be some transition issues. If we have a regulation that's intended to make the air cleaner, well, that might mean we're going to have fewer coal miners and we're going to have more engineers designing solar panels. That doesn't mean those coal miners are instantaneously going to become solar panel engineers. It's not very likely that all the coal miners will get retrained to be solar panel engineers, but rather coal miners will move into something that doesn't pay as well. Somebody else who would have done what the coal miners would have done does something else. Somebody else ends up migrating from West Virginia to Boston or Rockville, Maryland, and ends up taking a job that involved in the solar panel industry or wherever it is they design these things. So it's going to take time, and it's not going to be an immediate substitution. Yeah.
All your example, you mentioned Deadweight laws. Does that automatically imply some job losses? Deadweight.
Oh, what's in the short term, deadweight loss might imply some job losses. Over the longer term, deadweight loss basically means lower GDP, and so what we ought to see is an adjustment in wages and salaries. So over the longer term, deadweight loss ought to basically be reflected as lower income. But that's after all adjustments have occurred. In the short term, the deadweight loss might lead to some unemployment until the folks who lost their jobs find new jobs doing something else. But so the fundamental issue with regulation and jobs is not the effect on total employment, but rather how long does the transition period take, and what are the costs associated with transition when some people lose their jobs as a result of regulation, other jobs may be created. What does it take to move people from one thing to another? I'm not a labor economist by background, so I do not have any numbers to give you on this. What I can tell you, though, is that transition cost issue is the right question to be asking, rather than asking about how does regulation affect total employment. And so when you have somebody coming through your office talking about regulation and jobs, ask them about, okay, the employment effect is a short-term thing. What's the transition cost? Okay, and with that, I have one or two more slides, but with that, I think I want to stop and open it to questions so that we can, deal with the kind of issues that are on everybody's minds.
Anyone has questions? Yeah, and you won't be able to hear yourself through the mic, but what's going on in the video, so please speak into this. It might be a little confusing.
I think you mentioned this previously, but would like to ask again. Can you describe what is deadweight loss as far as in your description to your presentation, like what is actually happening during deadweight loss and what's being accounted for that?
Okay, yeah. Simplest way to illustrate it is with no, maybe that's not the simplest way to illustrate it. Deadweight loss is the value of stuff that's not produced because regulation either increases costs or directly leads to a reduction in the production of something. So if you have, say, a clean air regulation that reduces production of high sulfur coal, okay? The deadweight loss is the value that we would get from the production of that coal. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the regulation's a bad idea. It's just that you would want to compare that deadweight loss to, okay, what are the good things we get because of that regulation? So it's a sacrificed opportunity. It's what didn't occur as a result of the regulation, and that's in that sense, it's what we gave up in order to get whatever benefits the regulation produced.
I was hoping you might speak on cost-benefit analysis in practice. Specifically, one of the biggest challenges or most effective challenges, it seems, to Dodd-Frank and healthcare rules that are coming out is whether or not there's adequate cost-benefit analysis. The D.C. Circuit struck down, I think it was a proxy rule based on it, not like the SEC not doing adequate analysis. What do you see like being the effect moving forward? How are agencies changing their practices?
Well, I don't know if agencies are changing their practices, but just as context for people who don't follow that stuff in as great detail, most of the healthcare rules are going to come out of the Department of Health and Human Services, which as an executive branch agency is supposed to be doing regulatory analysis under the guidelines laid out in executive orders. And so what we ought to, the question we ought to ask about those regulations is, okay, how well does the regulatory analysis accompanying with those regulations live up to the expectations laid out in the executive orders that tell agencies how to do this stuff? Now, financial regulation is a little bit of a different story because most of that comes out of independent regulatory agencies: Securities and Exchange Commission, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the Federal Reserve, the new Consumer Financial Protection Board. Since those things are independent agencies, no president has chosen to try to impose the executive orders, regulatory analysis requirements on independent agencies. So with those independent agencies, you don't have OMB reviewing their regulations and saying, hey, wait, you're not sending this out until you do better analysis. The only check partially is with the Securities and Exchange Commission. There's language in their authorizing legislation that's interpreted as a requirement for some benefit cost analysis. And that's, my understanding is that's the grounds on which courts toss some regulations back to the SEC. So for the Securities and Exchange Commission issuing regulations under Dodd-Frank, yeah, those are going to have to pass muster with the courts interpreting the language in the SEC's authorizing legislation that requires some kind of benefit cost analysis. I don't know for sure if the CFTC has that, Commodity Futures Trading Commission. I know that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Federal Reserve are not under that kind of requirement, so legally they don't have to do any of this kind of stuff unless Congress changes the law or a president decides, I'm going to try to apply the executive order to an independent agency, and we'll fight that court battle to demonstrate that the president can indeed do that. Thus far, no administration has wanted that fight. But it's either going to be a president doing that or Congress changing the law that would get regulatory analysis requirements for the independent agencies. Yeah. Oh, if we can get the mic just so.
You think the CPI, the proposed change CPI, is a regulation, and you think it's a reallocation of resources? And you think it's a good idea?
Whoa, three big questions. Yeah, I think the way this stuff, my understanding, I mean, the change in the CPI is supposed to adopt a different definition of the CPI that reflects the fact that when prices of certain things go up, we substitute in less expensive things, so we don't always bear the full effect of inflation that you might think we have when you use the regular CPI. My understanding is that that's a proposal that would require a change in law, so that would actually be, Congress voting to change the law, not just a regulatory agency's decision. Yeah, it would certainly lead to transfers, and it's, from the little bit I've read about it, it sounds like the principal transfer would be people who are, well, actually, I guess it's kind of complicated, because in some cases, it means people who are receiving payments from the government would receive a bit less. In other cases, it means that other things that are adjusted using the CPI would change, so that, what is it, they index the tax brackets, and the tax bracket indexing wouldn't be adjusted as much, and so there would be a bit of an increase on the tax side too. But yeah, those are all transfers. Those are all transfers. Now, as far as whether it's a good idea, I mean, I think we ought to be using the most accurate definition of the CPI that exists. And aside from that, I'm not enough of an expert on price indices to tell you which one I think is more accurate.
I guess my question goes back to something we talked about before, where I was wondering, like in the case of a law that's being implemented for the first time, and there's usually, say for example, it's like a new Medicare coverage for some service. So there's a CBO figures out there's a cost to implementing legislation, so that it goes to regulation to actually do it. Is that cost still part of the regulatory cost that's considered in the analysis, or is that just a comparison of the different ways in which to implement it?
I'm trying to remember where I've seen regulations that are completely brand new like that. Because an awful lot of the regulations we have are, revisions of previous things.
Would you repeat it louder?
Oh, okay, yeah, the question is, when a regulation is something new, like say, I mean, would it be safe to say like a new program in Medicare or something? When a regulation is implementing something new, and CBO did an analysis of the legislation, then what does that imply for the regulatory analysis the agency does? And a good regulatory analysis ought to be taking account, when an agency has to issue a regulation implementing a spending program like that, the regulatory analysis ought to be taking that spending into account. And I think when I've seen agencies do that kind of thing in the past, sometimes they'll actually go back to the CBO analysis and say, oh, well, CBO already figured this out. In other cases, they'll say, well, CBO did this analysis, but with new information we've gotten since then, it's the actual figures may be a little bit different.
It might be worth note that CBO estimates the on-budget impacts. If they have studied, they'll estimate the broader costs and benefits, but that's not generally the purpose.
Oh, yeah. And I guess I was thinking of the question in terms of a regulation implementing a federal spending program where CBO would have done the analysis of the effect on the federal budget. But yeah, CBO analysis generally is not going to cover all of the likely costs or benefits of a regulation, unless for some idiosyncratic reason CBO was explicitly asked to try to figure that out on something.
I suppose one other question, from my perspective, Jerry, when you gave the list of the steps that you go through in regulatory analysis, if you had to rank priority-wise, the top, or more importantly, where does cost-benefit analysis come in on a priority ranking of those steps?
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, really, the first step that I laid out, which is understanding what kind of problem you're trying to solve and what the root cause of the problem is, really is the most important thing to do, because if you don't know what the nature of the problem is, how can you possibly come up with an effective solution? And in fact, I've seen several kinds of federal regulations that calculate enormous benefit figures, but the regulatory analysis doesn't define or provide evidence of what systemic problem the regulation is solving. And when I look at one of those, I think, gee, how on earth could the agency be so confident you're creating benefits when you haven't defined the problem you're solving or figured out why the problem exists? Some of the energy efficiency regulations come to mind where agencies will calculate very large benefits, but they can't explain, but most of the benefits boil down to people who buy cars are making irrational decisions about spending more money on a fuel-efficient car, and you get back much more in fuel savings. Or people buying a dishwasher aren't taking adequate account of the electricity savings in the future when they're deciding what kind of dishwasher to buy. That's what the benefit figures imply, but there's virtually no discussion in the regulation of, well, here's what the systemic problem is and here's why we know it exists. And in fact, I've even seen a few of these where the proposed rulemaking says, okay, well, here's the benefit cost analysis, and by the way, we're not sure what market failure we're addressing here, and we'd like comment on that. Somebody tell us what problem we're solving. So I'm a little concerned when agencies march into calculating costs and benefits without having defined the problem they're solving first.